Well, greetings. My name is Jay O'Brien, and I'm joined here with Dr. Tyler Yoder, and we're in Let's Talk. And Let's Talk is just a time to discuss and process issues of the day and kind of the intersection of faith and life. Because one of my favorite things is to just process, open, and ask questions and dialogue. And really, some of that is born out of my relationship with Tyler. We go back a number of years. And when I was talking to Megan about us hanging out, she reminded me about how when me and you and her and your wife, Kathy, would hang out, you and I would be speaking so passionately that they were wondering, like, are they arguing? It's like, oh, no, that's like their love language. That's just how they have a normal conversation about things they care about. So it's really good to hang with you, Tyler, and looking forward to getting to some of our conversation today about kind of the God of the Old Testament and New Testament and harmonizing some of that. But before we get to that, it's draft week. Are you gonna be watching the Browns? You're a big Browns fan. You gonna watch, or where are you at this week with the draft?
I'm actually really busy right now trying to just catch up with all of the professional athletes playing one another on PS4 and Xbox. So I'm not sure if I can fit the draft in, but perhaps.
Oh man, I remember when we watched the draft together. And do you remember who the Browns picked that year? I remember.
You remind me, please. I'm sure it was an excellent selection.
Brandon Whedon. It was the year of Whedon.
Yeah,
That didn't last very long.
turned out to be a great choice.
Hey, as a Bengals fan, the era of Burrow is about to begin. So
That's true. You can always join us on the dark side up there in Cleveland.
Oh man, we'll see. You never know. But so you are in Indiana right now. You're at Culver Academy. You got your PhD in Hebrew and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at Ohio State. That's where we go back. And now you're in Indiana. What are you teaching presently?
Yeah, so right now I am teaching sophomores and seniors in high school at a boarding school here in Northwest Indiana. For sophomores, I teach a Global Perspectives course, which is sort of a blend of history and literature together, looking at the entire globe. And then for seniors, I teach a range of courses, including religious texts and literature, mythology, and a new one called behavioral economics, which is really pushing me outside of my comfort zone, but it's been really fruitful as I think about the relationship between how our biases relate to our beliefs and how those in turn connect to our behavior. So thinking about the way that we think, the way that we act as interrelated.
That's awesome, man. That sounds so interesting. Different than some of the courses I took in high school, which even if I was in such an amazing course with you teaching it, I think I was so foolish at the time I wouldn't have been able to benefit on a good thing. But
I hear you. Growing up is hard.
yeah. And you and I, we did this theology on tap together back in the day with people, and people still have shared with me how much they benefited from that. We'd talk about pressing issues from science and the Bible, sexuality, a number of interesting topics. And so you're always really fun to dialogue with that. And speaking of which, today I wanted to talk through some questions that have been submitted to me have been related to kind of making sense of the God of the Bible, what we see in the Old Testament, and seemingly this focus of kind of the wrath or judgment of God, and then this God in the New Testament of Jesus and this emphasis of love and grace. And as we kind of think of that, one of the ways I've heard it kind of epitomized is in the Old Testament, you have God instructing his people in the conquest of Canaan, and then we have Jesus in the New Testament teaching that we need to turn the other cheek, that we should love and pray for our enemies. And so what are some of your initial thoughts on how to harmonize some of those differences? Are there differences between the God in the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament and the God we see in the New Testament? What are some of those differences, if there are any?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a really big question too. I would say my initial reaction to the question is that it's dangerous. And I say that carefully, but I have Marcion in mind. Marcion being well known from early church history as someone who said, like, this Old Testament, there's too much that there that really we don't need anymore, and we're just going to dispense with it. And we're going to focus on what really matters, the New Testament. And so we need to be New Testament Christians. And with that, we lost, 2/3 of Scripture. And there have been many who have followed Marcion's lead throughout the centuries. And there are some modern sort of neo-Marcionites in the world today who feel as though we don't really need what the Old Testament has to offer us. And so it's better just to focus on what makes us feel most comfortable. And there's a lot to be lost along the way. A number of different avenues to respond to. But I'll just start with simply saying that it's dangerous when we run from what is uncomfortable. And there's a lot of beauty in the discomfort. In fact, in the discomfort is often where we learn the most. That's what I tell my students all the time. How will we ever grow if we're not pushed to think beyond the horizon that we can see? If we're just preaching to the choir and just, we're yes men and yes women who smile and nod and go on with our day without being changed, then we're not really moving. We're just on treadmills.
Yeah, and there is some of that. Are you familiar with Andy Stanley and some of his, like, kind of getting unhitched from the Old Testament? He's a pastor in Atlanta, for those who don't know. Andy Stanley's great. We don't need to get into all of that, but you're right. Yeah, there is some contemporary discussion on this. Why do you think there is the view of a difference between the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament? Why do people have some of those concerns? Why would Marcion want to move past to just be New Testament? Why does Andy Stanley want to unhitch the church from it? Why do you believe that's the case?
That's a great question too, and the question itself is born out of a real concern with what we see when we actually flip through the pages and we encounter a narrative after narrative that shows judgment and shows anger and shows wrath, especially within the Old Testament. But one of the key things that I want to make sure we discuss today at some point, I'll just mention it here, is that the idea of there being some sort of like a strict or rigid dichotomy between the testaments is spurious. It's just not there. And the Old Testament has plenty of judgments and anger and wrath, but it also has lots of compassion and love, kindness. And the same thing can be said for New Testaments on both sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you see the idea of judgment in the New Testament. I mean, Jesus, in his own teaching, those are some of the ones that don't get highlighted a lot, but he speaks about the judgment of God and wrath of God, and yeah. And what are some of those then similarities between the Old Testament and New Testament that sometimes get overlooked? I mean, I think of Jonah, the story of this prophet who was sent by God to the Ninevites, and he wanted judgment, and God ends up extending mercy and grace. What do you think are some of the overlapping themes that sometimes get missed in pitting them against each other?
Yeah, I mean, wow. Where do you start and where do you go with that question? So much, obviously. I'm drawn to immediately because you mentioned Joshua early on and the Canaanite conquest, thinking of someone like Rahab, who is in some ways the exception to the rule, right? As Canaan is supposed to be taken out, dedicated to God, here's this foreigner, this prostitute, who is an outsider. She is other. She is not a part of the community, and she is protected in an act of compassion and preservation. It goes against the grain, and it flies in the face of what you expect in that book. And it is this glimpse of sunshine that comes through, that penetrates and reminds us that the God that is revealing himself over the course of the Testaments cannot be pigeonholed or boxed in. He refuses to be boxed in. Thinking of I always am drawn to this when I think of the complex character of God, that moment in the Chronicles of Narnia when Lucy and Tumnus are reflecting on Aslan as he is departing, what they just experienced The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and they reference the fact that he is in no way, shape, or form a tame lion. He cannot be domesticated. He cannot be turned into you or to me. And we have to deal with that, right? I mean, at the outset, deal with the fact that God is not us. And we have to alter our expectations, alter our perspective, and that's gonna be a lifelong learning process. But he's not, though he's not tame, he's good still. And the question then becomes, will you accept his paradigm for goodness or not? And the choice we all have to make at some points in our lives, right? And life and death depends on this. But it's a choice that is laid out for each and every member of creation to answer for themselves. Do you accept the rules of play?
That's good. Yeah, it reminds me one of my professors, Daryl Bach, who when he talked about the God dilemma, like a lot of, whether we're talking about things of the supernatural, like if you enter into it disbelieving that there's a God who can work outside of creation, you'll come to one conclusion or another. And even the same with some of these views that are unsettling. Like if there's a God, then that shapes, we come to him and we're not creating him in our image. We're not, I doesn't sit well with me today. But we have to revolve around kind of his perspective. Can you speak more to some of that? Like you mentioned earlier, that living in the tension or being willing to learn that it's in those places and spaces of wrestling with hard things that might be confusing, that's where we grow. Can you speak to that, even just as a teacher with your students, why you feel like that's the case? Why the Old Testament, with some of the questions that it can bring to the modern reader, is especially important as we think of growing personally, learning. Yeah, why the tension is required.
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure how exactly to respond best, I guess, by elaborating. I'm not sure this is what you had in mind or not, but I'll note that the Bible, it seems, and I would go further to say even that the Christian gospel represents this sort of hypothetical contract. And the witnesses or the signees of the contract, they're pledging to acknowledge a world that is governed by a certain conception of right and wrong, of morality. And in the Bible, it seems as though God is the standard of morality. And we refer to this as righteousness in a theological sense, right? God is righteous. And so our call is then to pursue righteousness in how we live. There's this contract that's available to us. And secularists and those of a confessional bent have both agreed, in different areas of study have agreed. And I'm reading right now with my students a book on justice by Michael Sandel. And they're right now, they're deep in the weeds with questions of moral dilemmas and difficult ethical questions that face all sorts of human beings. And secularists and those of confessional bent will both suggest that we are within our DNA, we are built to be moral and political creatures. We have ideas, we have thoughts, we have concerns, we have values, we have a lot that we think. And it's only when we are debating or deliberating, contemplating this like fundamental part of our fabric that we are able to be most fully human. And the Bible has a particular slant on this in terms of morality and the standard and how we are to live and what the right thing to do is in the world. But I think my point I want to make here is that part of all of us, like we were born to discuss, we were born to question, we were born to debate. and it's sort of baked in the cake of being human. And so that tension that you refer to here, it's we can avoid it to our own demise, but avoiding it actually is contradicting our nature, if that makes sense. It's going against how we were created to operate. And that's saying nothing about the answers, right? That's saying nothing about where we need to end up and what is the right decision and how do we then live. But the point is that we need to be processing and asking things, especially in open communities, in public life. The religious and the moral and the political should be a part of what we talk about because it is a part of how we were created. And when we deny ourselves, when we don't enter into those spaces. So to like maybe perhaps a growing emergence that suggests that we need to shy away from confrontation, to shy away from big questions and ideas. I would draw on this notion of the fact that we ourselves cannot escape this moral and political component to who we are. And it's when we actually enter into those domains and discuss and debate and argue and deliberate that we ourselves are able then to, it's almost like when you're working out, when you strain your muscles, it causes them to break down so that they can be rebuilt and become stronger, right? It's only when we can enter into those spaces socially, and intellectually and ethically and emotionally and spiritually that we can be broken down so that we can see gaps. We can see what we're missing. We can learn from others. And I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm going to share one more point that I think is really important here. And that is that we only see with our two eyes. And that's also part of being human, right? Like I can't see what you see, Jay. I can only begin to empathize with you once I have listened to you. And that requires that I'm actually there engaged when you're talking, right? Okay. But you have a different set of eyes. You have a different story. You have a narrative that may overlap with mine. It does overlap with mine in certain ways, right? But ultimately, this is your story alone. But what an abundance of wisdom and insight do I have to gain from entering into your story? And how thankful I am that I've had that privilege over the course of my life for a blip on the screen. But I mean, so God has placed us in this space that we call Earth, and He has given us revelation not in some esoteric language that's beyond our comprehension. That wouldn't make sense, right? It would be meaningless. He's met us where we are. And part of the power of His revelation is placing us in a space where we can actually see what things mean through our experiences, through others maybe who are in our community and those who are not in our community, learning from differences, learning from other perspectives, learning from different traditions. And we can see more fully, more colorfully, more robustly in the end when we enter into those spaces and roll up our sleeves, show our willingness to get dirty and hash out important topics, important questions. We need that. And when we ignore it, we limit our possibility as human beings, where we can go, what we can be.
That is so good. Because what you're getting at is the whole concept of what does it mean to be human, and as you know, as people of faith, Christians, we bring a certain anthropology to it. Like, you know, how did God create us? He created us as thinking beings. And to your point, you know, one of the things we see in the Old Testament and New Testament is God, He's entering in, revealing Himself, and He uses human language. He uses poetry. The Bible's not this list of a perfect systematic theology with all the we want to make it that sometimes, but it's God revealing in history and poetry. Jesus tells parables. He doesn't it's not like the Christian movie film where he kind of puts kind of hits you with the truth. He makes you discover, wrestle. A lot of times the apostles are like, what is he saying? What is he talking about?
For the record, Kirk Cameron would be in that film. That would be necessary.
Yeah, for sure. How do you personally, I mean, what does it look like for you on a personal level to enter into some of those tensions and process and, how do you deal with that just personally?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, I consider myself very privileged, and I need to recognize that, in fact, because I've been given the opportunity to spend years of my life dedicating just to thinking
Mm.
and going through graduate school and processing through big questions along the way. I'm so thankful. I'm grateful for that experience. But it wasn't so. My fascination with inquiry related to faith and life, faith and culture, predates the chance I had to enter into those spaces. And looking back, I mean, talking to my parents and others who knew me when I was a child, it's clear that sort of that's how I've always sort of operated in my various developmental stages. And
You were
so,
a question asker?
yes, I
You were like
was.
driving your parents crazy, like, why? What?
Exactly. I was the why kid. Um, Shut up, Tyler. And so, I don't know, personally, it's funny because you probably have already noticed that, the fact that when I get excited about something, my eyebrows raise. And at the end of the day, I can actually feel really exhausted up here, just because most of my day at times can be spent with those eyebrows raised because I'm so into what I'm talking about. My students make fun of me for that, but I personally, I don't know, drawn to the fact that death, and maybe this seems like I'm going off on a rabbit trail here. I don't think I am ultimately. I guess it's my responsibility to show how it connects. Ultimately, death is the most important part of being human.
Mm.
We are one of the few species in the world that actually knows we're going to die and thinks about this.
Mm.
And so death, as that great equalizer, is always sort of looming right around the corner somewhere. And we may think that we're invincible, we may forget about it, but we are constantly separated from it by this thin veil, right? And at times we can open the curtains, and unfortunately we experience the tragedy of loss. And we, in those moments, we're confronted with the reality of who we are as well, that we are finite and we won't last forever in this form. But then we go on with our lives, right? And so the idea of death reminds me of the need to live, and of the opportunity to maximize what's here in front of me today. Not placing all of my eggs in the someday when I accomplish this, or I can go there with my life, or when I've seen this happen or traveled to that place. And this is a challenge. This is a real challenge for me, to live in the moment, because this is what I have. And so when you ask about what is the personal draw you have, it's because I have a chance to live right now. And God has given me an opportunity to acknowledge this transcendent component to existence. The fact that somehow built into me is this understanding that life is bigger than me, and that there's some force that is actually governing the atmosphere and keeping all of my organs in place and allowing everything to function just right so I can keep breathing unconsciously. And if that is the case, that there is some force, some supernatural divine force at work that is somehow managing everything at a cosmic level, but also at an individual personal level, then why would I not spend my life ruminating on things of above? And it's not as though I have sort of given up the ghost of trying to prove, right? I no longer feel, and I did earlier in life, and I wasted time. I wasted energy trying to confirm and prove in some sort of empirical way X, Y, or Z. And I've given that up. But I find it no less important to spend time processing through the implications of my actions in within a context of something that is, that transcends space and time, that goes beyond this universe, that reaches back, millennia to the dawn of time, and is connected somehow to a future state that I can't imagine, that has me involved in some way. So I guess I just feel a sense of responsibility, and maybe this makes me a weirdo. It probably does, actually. We're all various degrees of weirdo, aren't we? But I don't know. I feel this sort of yearning that I am doing what, and even if it's like walking to work, and I'm outside and I hear birds chirping, or reflecting, like as I'm like in a moment, hearing my kids like run around the house and yell at one another, and I'm just reminded of like these complex forces at work. It draws me to gratitude, and it invites me to consider the fact that what I am seeing is just one small little pixel on this like divine, ginormous screen of life, and I want to know more about that.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, you are weird, and I'm weird. There's a lot of us weirdos out there that were the why question kids, and I'm almost a little rebellious at nature. If someone says, "Hey, you need to believe this," I'm like, "Do I?" And there's probably some good and bad in some of that, but I think it's really refreshing what you're saying, especially in Christian circles, because sometimes Christian circles, rather than being spaces where we wrestle with the truth, both what we would say is like kind of the divine revelation in scripture and then like common revelation in the world, there can feel this pressure to prove it, to have the answers, to have the systematic theology. And in some ways, we're trying to do what God hasn't done, to boil it all down and have the simple answers. And so there's a fear of asking questions. When I think that actually, and this is what back to some of our conversations way back, you really helped me with, is there's actually joy in the questions. And when you're living by faith, when you're really walking with God, you can't not have questions. Like if you don't care, it's like, you know what, I'm just going to show up to church, baseline level stuff. Maybe I believe it, maybe I don't. You're not really, it's like, okay, I'll take it and leave it. But when you're really like giving your life and you're investing and you're caring, man, you can't not wrestle with God. What do you say to some people in those settings who are maybe wrestling with some of kind of the deconstruction is a hot word? They're asking questions with their faith. They're wondering where's a safe space to process some of this. What would you say is like some kind of normal tips on someone who's asking those questions, where to go, how to be directed in the journey? What would you say to someone in that kind of space?
Yeah, so it sounds like you're asking two different things. Maybe how to respond to those who are in those spaces in terms of like how to deal with their questioning, and then where to go. And I'm perhaps less helpful on the second question, but I can offer my own experiences for the first part of it, I guess.
Yeah.
I would start by saying that like we're good. Like take a deep breath, and that questioning in you, like that's totally natural. That's how you were created, right? Like we know so little. There's this phrase I was introduced to in the last few years that's become sort of like part of my life mantra, and it's called epistemic humility. Simply like being humble about things that we know. I know so little, right? And I have so many questions. I often have way more questions than I ever have answers, right? And when I find answers, they often lead to more questions. And that's okay. That's all right. So first of all, like if you are in a space where you are hurting and you feel like you have been disappointed by others or let down in terms of like the answers that you've received or been given, that things didn't turn out the way that you were told they would, or maybe it's not all that it was supposed to be. I'm sorry, but we're all in this together, and we're all struggling to figure things out. But when we work together and we place others before ourselves and we humble ourselves as we enter into this space, this shared space, we have so much to gain and so much to learn. So maybe that's a very general response. In fact, it is. But I think it's important to know that like where you are in your journey, it's okay. It's all right. It's like we're not a finished product, and we are in a certain chapter of life that this chapter will eventually close. And there'll be a new chapter, but that hasn't been written yet. And I mean, the gospel calls us to take up our cross, deny ourselves, put something else before us, right? And to bear a load. There are very few guarantees in Scripture, and one of those guarantees is that life sucks, and you're going to suffer. It's one of the very few things we know is going to happen as human beings, right? While we're here on Earth, and so we might as well do this together and recognize the fact that we have a lot to learn from each other. And so rather than going about arguing for certainty, we can be recognizing the fact that everything that we do, and this is not simply just like a theological issue. I mean, scientists would when push really would have to agree as well that life boils down to faith, right? Like we're all making decisions without all the information. That has perhaps never been clearer than right now during our pandemic, when you see a million different projections of what life will look like in 2, 3, 6 months, 6 years, and everyone's all over the board. This is life, right? We know so little. There's so little information out there that is certain, and most of what we experience is less than, to varying degrees. And I go back to that, and I go back to that question I mentioned, or that point I made earlier. From a gospel perspective, the invitation is there. The standard has been set. God has set it himself, and he himself has emptied of himself, so that he might be able to communicate with us just where we are. We can see him and understand him and fellowship with him. The question simply is, will you accept? Will you walk? And it's not, will you walk in certainty? It's not like only come if you are sure that you know. He beckons us to walk in faith. And the life of faith continues to be marked by steps of faith over and over again.
That's really good. And I think it hits on kind of some of that two parts of the tension, or two ditches on the side of the road. I think sometimes some people on one side of the road, they can get so lost in the lack of certainty, and it's almost like they can't believe in anything unless it's provable scientifically. And when they come from, my experience has been walking with people, because in Clintonville and in our world today, this is a lot. This is a passion for me, why you and I have connected so well in discussing these things. But is walking with people in this, when they came from a church background where it had to be certain, and when it wasn't, or there were holes poked in some of their things they thought were certain, then it all unravels. And so it's almost like they can't move forward. And then on the other side of the ditch are people who have all the answers. There is no epistemic humility. They, won't entertain questions because they're afraid of entering up on the other side of the ditch. And I think that kind of courage, living by faith, means I'm walking with the Lord. I'm walking with Jesus, and I'll trust him to be God with some of the things I can't understand. and that he's a very secure God. He's not insecure. He's not like, you have any questions? You know, like, I mean, Thomas and the disciples, after he rose from the dead, they still were doubting. Like, I don't know how much more, like if Jesus came back and like, man, I don't know. I don't know. Like, and he didn't like banish them.
He showed, right? He showed the marks.
Yeah.
Like, here, see for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. He's a very secure, like, so an insecure leader can't tolerate someone asking them questions, or doubting them. When you're really secure about something, it's like, hey man, look, I'll help, but my like sense of being isn't dependent on you, what you think of me.
Yeah.
I think we see a lot of that security in Christ and God.
Definitely. And you and I have talked before at length about this, and maybe it's a rudimentary point, but I'll offer it still. I think it's helpful heuristically as we try to process through this. But the idea of like a closed and an open hand, right? There are certain things that we, so again, there are varying degrees of confidence that we can have in certain things. And there are a number of issues that Scripture itself, by nature of like the content, by nature of the extent to which it talks about whatever it is we're looking at, there are a number of like factors that lead to us like perhaps treading softly, like being careful in terms of making any rigid claims about this is the answer, or that is the right way, or this is the interpretation. There are certain things that we can close up, that fist and say, I will take this to the grave. And those are relatively few. For the most part, most of what we read about is open in some ways to discussion in terms of there are perhaps some different perspectives to approach this. And it's in that space, right, to go back to that earlier part of the conversation, it's in those spaces that we can grow to become more fully human, more fully how we were created to be in God's image by being a part of those discussions. Not necessarily to win. You're like, I have the answer and my job is to prove to you that you are wrong and then you can come to my side. No, it's to be a part of that rich interchange as human beings who are finite and limited and humbling themselves before not only one another, but before a transcendence that is yearning to find more of truth.
That's so good.
I don't know if it's helpful either, but I'll speak very frankly. And I don't even know who's listening to these things. It might just be, our parents.
Might be us and
but in the event that it's someone else that is actually going to listen to this, I'll just simply share my approach. You can take this or leave it. But this is what I find really helpful over time, and I've spent most of my adult life poring over the Scriptures in the original languages and struggling with, words here, meaning of phrases, grappling with tensions and variants, and difficult doctrines. And here's how I approach it in a nutshell. At the broadest level, my question is there a force bigger than me that has some sort of governance or authority over space and time, over the universe? And I personally answer that question, yes. I see too many, so I'm starting here at like a very general level, a position, right? Not committing myself to a particular conclusion, but just very broadly, is there a force that is binding existence together in some way, creation as a whole? And the answer for me is yes. There are too many reasons to suggest to me that the intricacy, the complexity points to dynamic handiwork that would have to exceed what we as humans are capable of on our own, or just random coincidence. And the next sort of level then, once I have decided that, like, yes, like a theistic framework makes sense, does this transcendent force seem to have some sort of immanent or a local personal engagement with the world? Do I have any like evidence that I can draw on from my experience or elsewhere that suggests that like the force that's in control is also like here somehow with us in this space, spiritually? And again, the answer is yes. And there are a number of different options, right? Like religious options out there in the world to consider in terms of like the right path. And while there are tons of similarities, and I'll be the first to admit that we have a lot to learn from other religious traditions, there are a number of differences, and then those differences need to be maintained even while there are similarities. The Christian gospel is distinctive, is absolutely distinctive, even while it shares quite a bit with some Eastern traditions, with other Abrahamic religions in terms of emphases, in terms of how to live, even the idea of God or the gods. And the question becomes, which of the options, right? Like, where do I go? And so the last sort of major step for me is, does the idea of inherent human brokenness make sense? And that's like part A, I guess. And it certainly does. I see that over and over in my life, right? Like even when I feel like I'm figuring things out, I'm introduced to new problems, like new fractures that reflect my own dismal state as a human being, my needy state. But the second part of that then is, if I can admit that I have needs, then how do I respond to the fact that those needs can only be met by something other than me, and by perhaps that same force that I've already recognized as governing the universe and being a part of my own local domain here, where I inhabit. And so I ultimately arrive at the Christian gospel by sort of that philosophical reasoning, where the Christian gospel is the only message that suggests that our brokenness can be fixed, not within us, not by us, but by another force. And the force that created us is the only solution to our problem. And so there are lots of other issues in Scripture, right? Lots of other things to discuss and debates, and perhaps we'll still get to some of those. But for me, like, I enter into the gospel by that kind of reasoning, and everything else almost becomes secondary or tangential in some way. And the fact that I, as a broken individual, am in need of help, I'm in need of delivery, and I can only ultimately experience that rescue by the same force that actually made me, is the explanation that makes the best sense to me in the end. And so maybe that gives a sense of like the process, like the inquiry process of that open hand and closed hand. There's so many issues, right? That, like, yeah, they're important still, but they're somewhere else. Like, they're in a different room. And we can get to those. And in fact, that would be cool to do that. Like, that would be really helpful and useful to do so. But what matters most is something different, right? And that can actually be contained within the singular fist.
That's really good. Yeah, the need to prioritize what God prioritizes. And that is the gospel. Like, that is the central. And anytime we make those open-handed issues the thing, the distinctives, the thing, we missed what is truly distinct about being Christian. And that's good stuff. Well, man, I really appreciate you joining us for this. Can we do it again? Because I think there's a lot of rabbit trails that we're going to want to run down. And I'd love to explore some of that more, some of those open-handed, closed-handed issues. How do we even process some of that? That would be really good stuff to address. And for people who are watching, if you have questions, you can reach out to me and Tyler. I hope you see that we love discussing this stuff. You will make our day by sending an email with a question that you struggle with. I promise you won't inconvenience us if you reach out. Tyler, thanks again, and I look forward to doing this again soon.
Thanks, Jay. It's always good to see your face.
Yeah, good to see you too, bro. Bye.
Bye.